Everyone's been talking about the big disaster, and understandably so. There's been a strong desire then in the space game community for decades to have a dream sim, the ability to fly ships through space, travel to distant worlds, do trade runs, be a pirate, all of that amazing stuff. And of course, the biggest purveyor of that dream is Star Citizen itself. So recently, they did a live demo of their new flagship mission. And what did they show us? A 4-person, ground-based FPS mission. So, no space at all then, in the most expensive space game ever made. Now, the live stream itself was definitely a disaster. A lot of people have been pointing that out, and we'll talk about it but later into the video because that's the part that really went viral everywhere. But for me, the disaster isn't really the most interesting part. What I find interesting here is something I don't think that many people have been talking about. It's what CIG chose to show us. So do stick around because that's the point I want to talk about. But first, I think we need to give you a little bit of background story here because not all of the viewers here are going to be aware of what's going on. So CIG had a very disastrous live stream about, 10 days ago, a little bit more at this point. But, it didn't kick off immediately until it was picked up by a YouTuber known as Kira. A lot of you have probably watched his content. And then that was picked up by Moist Critical. It went viral at that point, and so now we've got a situation where the gaming press is reporting on this disastrous event as well. I don't want to recount absolutely everything about it. We're going to have to touch on a few points though, because it's very relevant. So CIG decided to stream the Siege of Orison, which is a co-op mission that's been remade. And on top of that, this has already been a slip-in. Now, to CIG's credit here, they were upfront about the whole situation, because the version of this mission that's on the test servers right now is indeed struggling. CIG know it, the audience know it, the players know it, pretty much everyone who's involved on any level is more than aware of this. So when CIG wanted to live stream this mission, instead of using the build on the test servers, they used an internal build. And this is actually the same sort of thing we see a lot of studios do, from indie studios all the way up to AAA studios, because it means they can conduct this playthrough under ideal conditions. In other words, as CIG said themselves, they wanted to show this mission as it was intended to be played. But that's not how it went. After 90 minutes or so of weapons not firing right, inventory not behaving, the group getting completely separated, and eventually, well, they all got wiped out in a way that they couldn't come back from. And then that ultimately led to a very awkward situation where someone had to kind of get involved and tell the developers to wrap the stream. To be perfectly fair here to everyone involved, developers demoing unfinished software live is genuinely a difficult thing. Things often go wrong when the studios do this. We've seen this happen with big companies. Google have infamous events where they've tried to demoing things up on stage and it all goes wrong. Microsoft too. It's not something that's just limited to Star Citizen. But what's really different here is that every single article that's picked up on this, and indeed many of the YouTubers who have spoken about it, have all focused on the same thing. The version that CIG were using here, the hardware they chose was controlled. They chose to pick a very specific mission, and they all did this on a show that they scheduled themselves. In other words, they had the best possible scenario, the best possible case that they could establish, and they still couldn't hold the mission together for 90 minutes. And this is the thing that everyone's talking about, understandably so. A lot of frustration in the Star Citizen community, a lot of frustration online, and a lot of controversy everywhere else. It did indeed go viral. But for me, that wasn't the real issue. There was some underlying thing that a lot of other people don't seem to have spoken about as yet. Now, of course, the bugs were something that struck me, but that wasn't the main thing. The main thing here that I always come back to when it comes to these type of streams is how CIG talk about the game, because here they weren't talking about space. I mean, think about it. In their own language, they were talking about a first-person shooter design here pretty much from beginning to end. Where the cover is, where it's placed too close together, what type of weapons are best to use for close range, and different weapons such as shotguns and SMGs, which are better perhaps for longer range engagements. Talking about snipers and room clearing, everything here, everything they discussed, well, that's a shooter, isn't it? An FPS game. And that kind of brings me to the point I want to make here. Yes, it was a disastrous live stream. A disastrous live stream for the most expensive space game ever made. And ultimately this went viral. The funny thing about that, a lot of people's first encounter with Star Citizen then is not only going to be this crazy live stream, but the fact that in the most expensive space game ever made, no one actually gets to see any space game content. They simply get to see the whole developer team talk about a party of 4 ground-based mission. And yes, I'm sure you can make the point, a fairly reasonable one at that this is what the whole Siege of Orison is all about. And yeah, that's a reasonable argument to make. But there's an interesting little snippet here that speaks to a general direction that I'm seeing become more and more of a thing. So in this mission, to get to this whole siege on Orison on foot, you have to actually get to that location first. And do you take your own very expensive spaceship? No, you don't. You take a shuttle. They've chosen that because it gets you straight back into the fight. In other words, they've taken out the flying. The most expensive space game ever funded remade its flagship mission here, and one of the changes was removing the bit where you fly your spaceship. And CIG speak about this in all seriousness on their live stream in front of now millions of people. In fact, if you rewatch the stream, you'll notice that the host himself hands over the whole thing to the developers very early on, given the reason that he's terrible at FPS games because his glory days were Quake 3 and Tribes 2. So yes, that's the host of Star Citizen Live stepping back from playing Star Citizen because he isn't good at shooters. Now, like I say, you can reasonably make the point here that it's just one mission, and missions of course can vary. In fact, Star Citizen does have plenty of flying in it, and I'd completely agree with you. But there's just this underlying point that I really want to make here. That's why I decided to cover this particular topic in this video. So there's a set of upcoming planetary tech that CIG have been showing off. This is procedural placement of points of interest across whole worlds. And yes, as with many things with Star Citizen, it is genuinely impressive. I've said many times before, I think they've got the best planetary tech right across probably the space game genre, but likely across gaming as well, if we take out Microsoft Flight Simulator. So this entire new system that's called Star Architect or Starchitect is all about placing procedural points of interest in easier to reach locations. In other words, players will need to spend less time flying from A to B, less time in their spaceships. In the most expensive space game ever made, with spaceships that in some cases cost more real-world money than a car. And look, in all fairness, I understand the argument here. Flying somewhere and finding nothing isn't fun, or just spending hours in the ship doing nothing in between. It does somewhat become a bit of a loading screen. I've seen a lot of people claim that online. So yes, dense worlds are better than empty ones, that's very true. But sometimes it feels to me that there's a direction of travel here that's very difficult to miss. We've got a mission remake that removes the ship section to all intents and purposes, and then a design conversation is all about, for that mission, is all about covers and lanes and FPS combat, and then they're inventing a new tech that reduces the flying because the gap between the areas, the points of interest, are just too big. And this would be absolutely bizarre to me in any space game, let alone one like Star Citizen. Now, I'm not talking about the fact that Star Citizen is broken here, because everyone knows that it is broken. That's been true for years. Yes, it can work, it does work, a lot of people have a lot of fun in it, but I think even the most ardent fan will admit that from time to time, perhaps more often than not, the game can be broken. The issue here then for me is what CIG chose to control, or chose to show. They had complete control over what they showed everyone. They had their own build, their own servers, their own mission, their own schedule, their own showcase even. And every single thing about that 90 minutes would have been deliberately chosen. And what they chose to put in this is somewhat of a, I don't know how we could put it, it's kind of like a window into the development for people who are into the game, and perhaps for people who aren't yet into the game. And instead of talking about ships and space, what went viral, it's kind of genuinely funny really, what went viral is 90 minutes of on-foot content that ultimately didn't work. And for a project that's been funded on the dream of flying through space in some of the most expensive spaceships ever made, that seems like a really strange presentation for this type of game. So it's not that Star Citizen isn't a space game, because of course it is. It's just that the disaster here that everyone's been talking about is, well, it's interesting in and of itself, isn't it? but I just find it kind of interesting that the fact of what went viral about a space game was nothing to do with space at all. Let me know what you think about all of this in the comment section below, because I'd love to hear your take. There is another video on the screen right here if you want to check that out. Do take care, and I'll catch you next time.